The mist clung to the Highland glen like a burial shroud, thick and grey, and breathing with secrets that had slumbered in these mountains since before memory. And through this ghostly veil, the carriage bearing Lady Eleanor Ashford rattled along the narrow road that wound between ancient stones and darker shadows. The year was 1745, and autumn had come early to Scotland, painting the heather in shades of dying purple, while the wind carried whispers of rebellion and old blood feuds that never truly healed. Eleanor sat alone in the velvet-lined compartment, her gloved hands folded in her lap with practiced stillness, though her eyes, grey as the mist itself, watched the alien landscape pass beyond the rain-streaked window with something between fascination and unease. She had been travelling for 3 days now, sent north by her father on business she did not fully understand, accompanied only by a coachman and footman who grew more silent with each mile they ventured into these wild territories. The horses slowed, and Eleanor felt the change before she heard it, a tension in the air, a wrongness that prickled along her spine like frost forming on glass. Then came the cry, guttural and fierce, words she did not recognize, torn from throats that had learned their battle songs in these very hills. The carriage lurched violently, and Eleanor was thrown against the side as chaos erupted around her, the thunder of hooves, the sharp report of a pistol, her coachman's strangled shout cut terrifyingly short. The door was wrenched open, and she saw them, warriors wrapped in tartan and shadow, their faces painted with determination and something colder, more purposeful than mere banditry. Hands seized her, rough and unyielding, and though she fought with every ounce of strength her corseted frame could muster, she was pulled from the carriage like a doll, her protests swallowed by the mist. They bound her wrists with rope that bit into her skin through her fine kid gloves, and she was lifted onto a horse, held before a man whose Gaelic commands sent the others into swift, practiced motion. Asterisk. This cannot be happening, asterisk, she thought, her mind struggling to comprehend how quickly her world had shattered. Asterisk. This does not happen to ladies of standing, to daughters of English lords. Asterisk. But the horse beneath her was terribly real, and the arm locked around her waist was iron, and the mist parted before them to reveal a path climbing ever upward into the mountains. They rode for what felt like hours, through valleys where no English voice had echoed in generations, past lochs that lay still, as dark mirrors reflecting a sky heavy with coming storm. And then, as if conjured from nightmare itself, the fortress emerged from the fog, Castle Dunore, its towers rising like blackened fingers clawing at the heavens, its stones ancient and unyielding, a monument to Highland defiance that had weathered centuries of siege and sorrow. The gates groaned open at their approach, and Eleanor was carried through into a courtyard where torches guttered against the damp, and faces watched from shadows with eyes that held no welcome. As she was pulled from the horse and her feet touched the cobblestones of this forbidding place, Lady Eleanor Ashford understood with terrible clarity that whatever life she had known was over, and whatever awaited her within these walls would demand from her strengths she had never been asked to find. They brought her through corridors of cold stone where torches cast dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of old sorrows, and Eleanor forced herself to walk with her spine straight and her chin lifted, though her bound wrists ached and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The great hall of Castle Dunore opened before her, vast and imposing, its walls hung with tartan banners and ancient weapons that gleamed dully in the firelight, and at its far end, seated in a chair that might have been a throne for all its carved severity, waited the man who had ordered her abduction. Callum MacTavish, Duke of Dunore, rose as she was brought before him, and Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat at the sight of him, tall and broad-shouldered, built like the warriors of legend she had read about in forbidden books, his dark hair swept back from a face that bore the evidence of violence, in a scar that traced from his left temple to his jaw like a river of old pain. But it was his eyes that held her, grey as winter steel and equally cold, regarding her with an expression that seemed to weigh her very soul and find it wanting. "Lady Eleanor Ashford," he spoke, and his voice was deep as the lochs she had passed, carrying the rolling cadence of the Highlands that transformed her name into something almost foreign. "Daughter of Lord Henry Ashford of Thornbury." She refused to tremble, though every instinct screamed at her to cower before this man whose reputation had reached even the sheltered drawing rooms of England, the Highland Devil, they called him, the Duke who had sworn blood oaths against the English crown and kept them with terrible efficiency. "You have made an error, Your Grace," she said, and was proud that her voice emerged steady. "I am of no importance to anyone. My father will not." "Your father," Callum interrupted, and now his eyes blazed with something that burned far hotter than ice, "betrayed my family to English executioners. He gave false testimony that sent my brother to the gallows." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, and she saw him reach unconsciously for his hand. Where a ring glinted too small for his finger, she realized, worn on a chain around his neck, a dead man's ring kept close to a grieving heart. "Jamie was 20 years old," Callum continued, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting, a quiet fury that filled the hall like smoke. "He trusted the wrong Englishman, believed promises of safe passage, and your father sold that trust for 30 pieces of silver and a title." Eleanor's mind reeled, searching memories of her distant, distracted father for any hint of such monstrous capability, and finding terrifyingly no evidence to refute it. "I knew nothing of this," she whispered. "Your ignorance is irrelevant," Callum replied, and his smile was a terrible thing, holding no warmth whatsoever. "You are here as collateral, Lady Eleanor. Your father owes a blood debt to Clan MacTavish, and until he pays it in gold, in land, in whatever currency might begin to account for a life stolen, you will remain my prisoner. Whether you leave these walls alive depends entirely upon how much Lord Ashford values his only daughter." He gestured to his men, dismissing her, and as Eleanor was led away to whatever cell awaited her, she understood with sickening clarity that her fate rested in the hands of a man who had never valued her at all. The chamber to which they brought her was not the dungeon Eleanor had steeled herself to expect, and this small mercy somehow made her situation feel more precarious, as though comfort were merely another form of cruelty designed to keep her uncertain of her fate. The room occupied the upper reaches of the castle's eastern tower, circular and furnished, with a canopied bed draped in faded blue velvet, a writing desk positioned beneath a narrow window, and a fireplace where flames crackled against the Highland chill that seeped through ancient stones. A prison, yes, the heavy bolt, sliding home on the outside of the oak door made that abundantly clear, but a gilded one, and Eleanor found herself wondering whether this had been someone's bedchamber once, whether the books lining the small shelf had been placed there by hands now stilled by time or tragedy. She stood at the window as the grey morning light filtered through glass warped by centuries, and below her the castle revealed itself in glimpses through the dissipating mist. A courtyard where men trained with swords and fierce efficiency, a kitchen garden where women bent to their work with the resigned rhythm of those who had always known hardship, children chasing chickens between the outbuildings with laughter that seemed impossible in such a grim place. Asterisk. They do not look like monsters, asterisk, she thought, watching a young mother hoist a babe onto her hip while calling to an older child. Asterisk. They look like people who have learned to find joy in small spaces, because the larger world has offered them only grief. Asterisk. And with that thought came another, more troubling. If Callum MacTavish spoke true, if her father had indeed betrayed these people, sent a young man to his death for English gold, then who, truly, were the monsters in this tale? Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass and allowed herself to examine, perhaps for the first time with any honesty, the man whose blood she shared. Lord Henry Ashford had always been more portrait than parent, a figure glimpsed at holidays and formal occasions, his attention never quite focusing on the daughter who looked too much like the wife he had lost. She had been 7 when her mother died of the fever, 7 when her father had looked upon her grief-stricken face and seen only an inconvenience, shipping her off to a maiden aunt in Devonshire, where she might be raised without troubling him. Letters came rarely, visits even less so, and Eleanor had learned to build her life around an absence, constructing a dutiful daughter's devotion from nothing more than obligation and the fading memory of a man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders to see a Christmas parade. Asterisk. He will pay, asterisk, she told herself, clinging to the hope like driftwood in a storm. Asterisk. Whatever quarrel lies between him and the Duke, I am still his daughter, he will not abandon me to this. Asterisk. But even as she formed the thought, a quieter voice whispered from the hollow place her childhood had carved. Asterisk. When has he ever chosen you? Asterisk. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie, and a servant entered bearing a tray of food. simple fare but plentiful, oat bread and cheese and slices of cold meat. The woman set it down without meeting Eleanor's eyes, her face a mask of carefully maintained hostility, and Eleanor understood that in this castle she wore her father's sins like a brand visible to all. Outside, the mist had finally lifted, revealing mountains that stretched toward an endless grey sky, and Eleanor watched the MacTavish clan go about their lives, wondering how long before her father's reply would come, and what would become of her if the answer was silence. 5 days Eleanor had been confined to her tower chamber, 5 days of watching the Highland world turn beneath her window, while her mind churned with questions that found no answers, and on the morning of the 6th day she decided that if she must be a prisoner, she would not be a silent one. She would not give the Duke of Dunore the satisfaction of seeing her diminished into meek acceptance of her fate. When the servant woman arrived with her breakfast tray, Eleanor spoke before the door could close again. "I require books, if this household possesses any, and I should like to know how long I am expected to survive on bread and cheese alone when I have committed no crime beyond the accident of my birth." The woman's eyes widened at this outburst from the English prisoner, had barely spoken in nearly a week, and she retreated without response. But something had shifted. Eleanor felt it in the quality of the silence that followed, a ripple spreading outward from her small rebellion. That afternoon, the bolt slid back, and it was not a servant who entered, but Callum MacTavish himself, filling the doorway with his imposing presence, and Eleanor rose from the window seat, where she had been watching clouds gather over the distant peaks, refusing to let him see how her pulse quickened at his unexpected appearance. "I am told you have demands," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been amusement if his grey eyes had not remained so carefully cold. "I have requests appropriate to any civilized captivity," Eleanor replied, and she marveled at her own steadiness, at the way words could become armor when worn with sufficient conviction. "Unless barbarism is the custom of your household, in which case I shall adjust my expectations accordingly." A muscle twitched in his scarred jaw, and for a moment she thought she had pushed too far, had prodded the Highland devil into showing his teeth, but instead he made a sound that was almost, impossibly, a laugh, harsh and brief as winter sunlight. "You've spirit, Lady Eleanor. I'll grant you that more than I expected from Ashford's blood." He moved into the room, and she noticed how his hand rose unconsciously to touch the ring hanging at his chest, that small golden circle that had belonged to his dead brother, and in that gesture she glimpsed something beyond the warlord's facade, a man still raw with grief, still reaching for a ghost. "Books you shall have," he continued, his voice roughening as though aware he had revealed too much. "And I'll speak to the kitchens about more substantial fare. But make no mistake, comfort does not change your circumstance. You remain here until your father answers for what he has done." "And if he does not answer?" Eleanor asked quietly, the question that had haunted her sleepless nights finally given voice. "If the man you believe will pay any price for my return proves to be exactly what I have always feared, a father in name only, incapable of valuing anything he cannot spend or display." Callum studied her then with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he were seeing past the composed exterior to the lonely child who had learned too young that blood did not guarantee love. "Then we shall both have our answers about Lord Ashford's character," he said finally, and turned to leave, pausing at the door to add, almost gently, "The library is extensive. I'll have selections sent up. Even prisoners deserve escape into better worlds than the one that holds them." The freedom, when it came, arrived not with announcement, but with absence, the bolt no longer sliding home after the servant delivered her morning tray, the door yielding when Eleanor pressed her palm against its weathered oak, and she stood for long moments on the threshold of her tower chamber, heart hammering against her ribs as she contemplated what this shift might mean, whether it was trust or merely a different configuration of her captivity. She descended the winding stone stairs with careful steps, emerging into corridors that smelled of peat smoke and centuries, and no one stopped her, though she felt eyes following her progress like the weight of stones, the household watching to see what the English prisoner would do with her lengthened leash. It was in the great hall that she first encountered Moira Campbell, the housekeeper whose domain encompassed every corner of Castle Dunmore, a woman whose face bore the particular hardness of grief, worn so long it had become indistinguishable from bone. "So you're to have the run of the place, then," Moira said, her voice carrying the music of the Highlands beneath its frost, and Eleanor met her gaze without flinching, recognizing in those dark eyes the same hollow space she had glimpsed in her own mirror, the mark left by losses that could never be adequately mourned. "I have been granted movement within the walls, yes," Eleanor replied carefully, "though I suspect you would prefer I had remained in my tower, out of sight if not out of mind." Something flickered across Moira's weathered features' surprise, perhaps at being addressed so directly by a woman who should by rights have been cowering. "My preferences matter little, Lady Eleanor. I follow my laird's commands, as all here do. But know this, I buried 2 sons because of English treachery, and their graves lie cold on the hillside, where the heather grows thickest. You'll find no warmth from me." Eleanor absorbed this blow as she had learned to absorb so many others, with stillness rather than reaction, but she filed the knowledge away in the growing catalogue of suffering her countrymen had inflicted upon this place. She wandered the castle throughout that first day of partial liberty, discovering the stable where a gentle giant of a man named Angus spoke to horses in soft Gaelic, and offered her a shy smile despite her English bearing, showing her the mare that had belonged to young Master Jamie, before the light left his eyes at the mention, and he turned back to his work with trembling hands. She found the kitchen gardens where herbs grew in defiance of the harsh climate, and the small chapel where candles burned before a shrine she did not yet understand, and everywhere she went she collected fragments of a story, written in the lined faces and guarded words of people who had endured more than she could fathom. It was Flora who broke through first, a kitchen maid of perhaps 12 years, with hair like autumn fire and a gap-toothed smile she deployed in secret, slipping into Eleanor's chamber that evening with a sprig of purple heather clutched in her small fist. "For luck, my lady," the child whispered, pressing the flowers into Eleanor's palm before darting away, and Eleanor stood holding that fragrant gift as tears she had forbidden herself finally traced silent paths down her cheeks, because kindness from unexpected quarters had always been her undoing, and she was beginning to understand that the MacTavish's hatred was not the monolithic force she had imagined, but rather a landscape as complex as the Highlands themselves, peaks of fury and valleys of tenderness, and somewhere in between, the possibility of something she dared not yet name. The storm announced itself at dawn, with a sky the color of bruises, purple and grey swirling together above the mountain peaks, and by midday the wind had risen to such ferocity that the castle seemed to shudder in its ancient bones, rain lashing against the windows with a violence that made Eleanor think of all the tears these Highlands must have witnessed across the centuries of clan warfare and English betrayal. She had been restless all morning, pacing her chamber until the walls felt like they were pressing inward, and when the worst of the tempest drove everyone deep into the fortress's interior, she found herself drawn to the library. Callum had mentioned weeks ago a room she had glimpsed but never properly explored, its door standing open now like an invitation she could not refuse. The space was larger than she had imagined, shelves climbing toward vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, the smell of leather and old paper and centuries of accumulated wisdom wrapping around her like a familiar embrace, and she was so absorbed in trailing her fingers along the spines of volumes she had never hoped to find in such a remote place. Chaucer and Spenser, translations of Ovid, collections of verse both English and Scottish, that she did not hear his approach until his voice came from the doorway, low and rough. "I wondered when you would find your way here." Eleanor turned to find Callum standing at the threshold, rain-dampened and looking almost uncertain, as though he had not expected to encounter her in this space that was clearly his sanctuary, and for a moment neither spoke as thunder rolled across the mountains like the voice of ancient gods expressing their displeasure. "You have Donna," she said finally, because it was safer to speak of books than to acknowledge the strange electricity that seemed to arc between them, more powerful somehow than the lightning illuminating the windows in brief, brilliant flashes. "I did not expect to find English poetry in the home of a man who despises the English." He moved into the room then, and she watched him select a volume from a shelf near the cold fireplace, his scarred hands handling the leather binding with a tenderness that seemed at odds with everything she knew of his reputation. "I despise English cruelty, Lady Eleanor, English arrogance and English greed, but I have never been fool enough to reject beauty simply because of its origin." He opened the book and read without preamble, his voice transforming as the verses rolled from his tongue. "Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so." My brother loved these words. spoke them, even at the end, when he stopped, his jaw tightening, and Eleanor found herself crossing the distance between them without conscious thought, drawn by the raw pain that had broken through his careful armor. "When I was a girl," she heard herself say, "my mother would read to me from the metaphysical poets, and after she died I would recite them alone in my chamber, as though the words might summon her ghost back to me. If yet I have not all thy love, dear, I shall never have it all." Their eyes met, and in that moment the storm outside seemed to fade to insignificance beside the tempest building within the library's walls. Two wounded souls, recognizing in each other a kinship neither had sought, but both had desperately needed. And when Callum finally spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Perhaps we are not so different after all. You and I, both of us seeking solace, in verses written by the dead, both of us haunted by those we have lost." They talked then as the storm raged on, hours slipping past unnoticed, as they traded favorite passages and debated interpretations, and slowly, carefully, began to see each other as something more than captor and captive, enemy and enemy's daughter. And when at last the thunder quieted and Eleanor returned to her chamber, she carried with her the memory of Callum's rare, reluctant smile, and the growing certainty that her heart was venturing into territory far more dangerous than any Highland wilderness. She found the portrait 3 days after the storm, tucked away in a corridor she had not yet explored, and the face that gazed back at her from the canvas stopped Eleanor mid-stride, as surely as if a hand had reached out from the painted surface to grip her heart. The young man in the portrait was unmistakably a MacTavish. He shared Callum's strong jaw and the particular set of the shoulders that spoke of Highland pride. But where the Duke's features had been carved by grief into something hard and forbidding, this face was all warmth and mischief, dark eyes dancing with laughter, lips curved in a smile that suggested he had just told a joke or was about to, a face that had never known the weight of betrayal or the cold kiss of the executioner's rope. "That was Jamie," came Moira's voice from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find the housekeeper standing in the shadowed corridor, her weathered face softer than Eleanor had ever seen it, touched by a sorrow so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. "Painted on his 19th birthday, 6 months before your father." The older woman stopped, her throat working, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest as she looked again at that laughing portrait, at the young man who had been barely older than a boy when he died. "Tell me," Eleanor said, and it was not a command but a plea, because she needed to understand the full measure of what had been done in her family's name, needed to know the shape of the wound she had unwittingly been sent to salt. Moira studied her for a long moment, searching for something in Eleanor's face, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, for she began to speak in the low, rhythmic cadence of someone recounting a tale told too many times in the dark watches of grief-filled nights. Jamie was the light of this castle, where Callum was serious, responsible, burdened with the knowledge that he would one day lead. Jamie was joy itself, forever laughing, forever making others laugh, the sort of soul that makes you believe God might be merciful after all. He was captured during a raid that your father's intelligence made possible, sold out by a man who had broken bread with our laird, who had sworn friendship while plotting betrayal. They took Jamie to Edinburgh, made a spectacle of his trial, called him a rebel and a traitor, when all he had ever done was love his homeland. Callum rode for days trying to reach him, but your father, Moira's voice broke, your father ensured the execution happened before any rescue could be mounted. Jamie was 20 years old when they hanged him before a jeering English crowd, and they say he faced death with a smile, reciting poetry until the rope stole his voice forever. Eleanor pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself, her vision blurring with tears she did not try to hide, and when she returned to her chamber she sat at the small writing desk and composed a letter to her father with hands that shook with fury and shame, demanding to know if the accusations were true, demanding an explanation, demanding something that might make sense of how a man could condemn a laughing boy to death for profit and politics. And as she sealed the letter with wax, she did not yet know that her father's response would shatter whatever fragile illusions she still harbored about the blood that ran through her veins. The weeks that followed seemed to reshape the very nature of Eleanor's existence within Castle Dunore, each day softening the edges of her captivity until she could no longer say with certainty where imprisonment ended and something else, something she dared not name, began. It started with small things. Moira no longer locked Eleanor's chamber door at night, and the guards who had once shadowed her every movement faded into the background like morning mist, burned away by Highland sun. Eleanor found herself drawn to the kitchens, where the warmth of the great hearth and the rhythm of familiar domestic tasks offered comfort she had not known she craved, and though the kitchen women regarded her with suspicion at first, her willing hands and genuine desire to be useful gradually wore away their resistance like water-smoothing stone. She learned to knead bread the Scottish way, to prepare bannocks and oatcakes, to understand the particular alchemy of herbs that transformed simple ingredients into sustenance for body and soul. The herb garden became her special province, a tangled, neglected plot behind the kitchen wing that Eleanor coaxed back to life, with knowledge passed down from her mother's gentle hands, and she found solace in the green, growing things, in the honest labor of weeding and planting and nurturing fragile shoots toward the sun. Callum watched her, though he thought himself unobserved, standing in shadowed doorways or pausing on the battlements above the garden, his grey eyes following her movements with an intensity that troubled his sleep and invaded his waking thoughts. He told himself he was merely keeping watch over his prisoner, ensuring she did not attempt escape or mischief, but the truth was a thornier thing that caught in his chest whenever she laughed at something Flora said, or pushed escaped tendrils of dark hair from her dirt-smudged face. Their encounters grew longer now, no longer the terse exchanges of captor and captive, but conversations that wandered through territory. Neither had mapped before he spoke of the burdens of leadership, of decisions that haunted him in the dark hours, of the weight of being responsible for hundreds of souls in a land where English boots threatened to crush all that his ancestors had built, and she listened with an attention that felt like a gift he had not earned and did not deserve. Eleanor, for her part, began to see past the legend of the brutal Highland Duke to the man beneath, exhausted by grief he could never fully express, isolated by the very power that defined him, carrying his brother's death like chains wrapped around his heart. She watched him settle disputes with wisdom and fairness, saw how his people looked to him with trust rather than fear, noticed the way he always ensured the poorest crofters had food before he himself ate, and each observation reshaped her understanding until the enemy she had been taught to expect became something far more complex, far more human, far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The ground between them had shifted, and neither knew anymore which of them was truly the prisoner. The fever came upon Flora like a thief in the night, stealing the color from her cheeks and the light from her eyes, and by morning the child who had so recently danced through the castle corridors with Heather clutched in her small fists lay burning and delirious in the servants' quarters, her breath coming in rattling gasps that echoed through the stone halls like a death knell. Eleanor heard the commotion from the herb garden where she had been gathering rosemary in the pale morning light, and something in the pitch of the voices, that particular timbre of fear that transcends language, sent her running before she could think to seek permission. She found Moira bent over Flora's narrow cot, the housekeeper's weathered hands pressing cool cloths to the child's forehead with a desperation that bordered on violence, and when Eleanor pushed through the gathered servants and announced that she could help, that her mother had trained her in the healing arts before consumption had claimed her gentle life, Moira turned on her with eyes blazing like coals in a dying fire. "You think I would let English hands touch this child?" the older woman spat, and Eleanor understood in that moment the depth of hatred that war and loss had carved into these Highland hearts, understood that every English face wore her father's features in Moira's grief-clouded vision. But Flora moaned and thrashed, crying out for her mother who had died 2 winters past, and Eleanor stood her ground with a steadiness she had not known she possessed, speaking quietly of yarrow and elderflower, of feverfew, and the cooling properties of willow bark, until something in Moira's rigid posture fractured, and she stepped aside with a gesture that was less permission than exhausted surrender. Through the endless hours that followed, Eleanor worked with hands made steady by purpose, brewing tinctures and preparing poultices, bathing Flora's burning skin with herb-infused water, singing softly the lullabies her own mother had once sung in a sick-room far to the south, where death had come despite all loving intervention. She did not notice when Callum appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the narrow space as he watched the English noblewoman, his prisoner, his enemy's daughter, fight for the life of a Scottish kitchen maid with the same fierce determination his own warriors brought to battle. He watched her through the night as candles guttered and were replaced, as Flora's fever spiked and raged, and finally, in the grey hours before dawn, began at last to break like a storm, spending itself against the mountains. He saw Eleanor's hands tremble with exhaustion as she coaxed broth between Flora's cracked lips, saw her weep with quiet relief when the child's breathing eased and her skin cooled to something approaching human warmth, and in that moment Callum MacTavish felt something shift in his chest, some fundamental understanding, rearranging itself like tectonic plates beneath the surface of the earth. She was not her father's daughter, not in any way that mattered, and the vengeance he had nursed like a sacred flame suddenly seemed a smaller, meaner thing than the woman who knelt exhausted beside a servant's cot, having given everything she had to save a life that meant nothing to her world, but everything to his. Flora's recovery was declared certain by midday, the child sleeping peacefully with colour returning to her cheeks like roses blooming after frost, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to be led away from the sick room by gentle hands that pressed her toward rest. She could no longer deny her body craved. But sleep would not come despite her exhaustion, and as evening fell over Castle Dunore, with its particular Highland melancholy, that blue-grey light that seemed to hold all the sorrow and beauty of the ancient land in its gathering shadows, Eleanor found herself drawn to the great hall where a fire blazed against the creeping autumn chill. She had thought herself alone, had settled into a chair near the hearth with a book she lacked the strength to read, when Callum emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, like a spectre summoned by her wandering thoughts, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence between them filled with the crackle of burning peat and the wind's eternal song against the castle walls. He sat across from her without invitation, and Eleanor noticed that the hard lines of his face seemed somehow softened in the amber glow, the scar that ran from temple to jaw less fearsome than it appeared in daylight, and when he finally spoke his voice carried a roughness that had nothing to do with his usual commanding tone. "Jamie would have liked you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious, drawn up from depths he rarely allowed anyone to glimpse. He had your spirit, that same stubborn refusal to accept the world as others insisted it must be. He used to drive our father to madness with his questions, his challenges, his absolute conviction that things could be better than they were. Eleanor watched as Callum's hand moved unconsciously to the ring he wore on a chain beneath his shirt, Jamie's ring, and she understood she was witnessing something rare and fragile. This fierce man, allowing his armor to fall away piece by piece in the firelight's forgiving glow. He spoke then of childhood summers spent roaming the hills together, of teaching Jamie to fish in the cold Highland streams, of the way his brother's laughter had echoed through these very halls like music that could never be replaced, and his voice broke on the telling in ways that revealed the guilt he carried, the older brother who had survived when the younger had not, who had been away when Jamie was captured, who had arrived too late to do anything but cut down his brother's body from the gallows, where English justice had displayed its triumph. Eleanor found her own eyes burning with tears she did not try to hide, and when Callum fell silent, she offered him the only gift. She had her own grief, her own wounds laid bare before him. She told him of her mother, gentle Elizabeth, who had taught her the healing arts in the precious years before illness had claimed her, of standing alone at a graveside at the age of 8 while her father conducted business elsewhere, of being sent to distant relatives who resented her presence, of growing up hungry for a love that was always promised and never delivered. They sat together until the fire burned low, two wounded souls recognizing in each other the particular loneliness of those who have learned too young that the world offers no guarantees of kindness, and when at last Eleanor's exhaustion claimed her and her eyes fluttered closed, Callum remained watching over her sleep, understanding with terrible clarity that somewhere in the alchemy of shared sorrow, the woman he had taken as a prisoner had become something far more dangerous. She had become necessary. The letter arrived on a morning when frost had painted the castle windows with delicate crystalline patterns, nature's artistry rendered in ice and silence, and Eleanor had been in the herb garden cutting the last of the autumn sage when Callum found her, his expression carved from the same granite as the mountains that surrounded his ancestral home, and in his hand he held a sealed parchment bearing her father's crest, that familiar eagle clutching arrows that had once represented safety and belonging, but now seemed only a cruel mockery of familial bonds. She took the letter with hands that trembled, despite her attempts at composure, and Callum did not leave as she had expected, but remained standing beside her among the dying herbs. close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body against the autumn chill, and she understood with sudden clarity that he already knew what the letter contained, that his messenger had reported her father's response before delivering the physical proof of her abandonment. The wax seal broke beneath her thumbnail, with a sound like something small and precious shattering, and Eleanor read her father's words in the slanting morning light, while the world she had always known crumbled to ash around her. The letter was brief, dismissive, written in the hand of a secretary rather than Lord Ashford himself, informing her captor that the girl in question had been a disappointing investment from birth, that no ransom would be forthcoming for damaged goods, that the Duke of Dunore was welcome to keep his prisoner as recompense for whatever imagined slight had prompted this inconvenience. Asterisk. Damaged goods. Times. Eleanor read the phrase 3 times, each reading driving the blade deeper into her chest, and she thought of every letter she had written to her father over the years, every desperate plea for affection or acknowledgement, every birthday spent wondering if perhaps this year he might remember she existed, and she understood at last that the coldness she had always sensed in him was not mere neglect, but something far more terrible. It was genuine indifference, the complete absence of love where love should have been the most natural thing in the world. The letter slipped from her fingers, caught by the wind and tumbling across the frost-hardened ground like a wounded bird, and Eleanor felt her knees buckle, would have fallen among the withered sage, and Rosemary had Callum's arms not caught her, strong and steady and inexplicably present in this moment of her absolute destruction. She did not weep, the betrayal was too complete for tears, too vast for any response, save the silence of utter devastation, and Callum held her against his chest without speaking, his hand cradling the back of her head as she pressed her face into the rough wool of his plaid and breathed in the scent of peat, smoke and heather, and something essentially him, this man who had taken her prisoner and shown her more consideration in weeks than her father had managed in a lifetime. When she finally lifted her head, Callum's grey eyes held something she had never seen there before, not pity, which she could not have borne, but anguish, raw and unguarded, as though her pain had somehow become his own, and in that moment the last chains of her old life fell away entirely, leaving her standing in the ruins of everything she had been, terrifyingly free. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended silence, Eleanor moving through the castle like a ghost, uncertain whether she haunted the stones or was haunted by them, and then Callum summoned her to his study, that room she had entered only once before, when she had stood defiant and terrified before a man she believed her enemy. And how distant that woman seemed now, how naive in her certainties about who deserved her loyalty and who her hatred. He stood by the window as she entered, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the grey Highland sky, and when he turned to face her she saw that he had not slept, that the same devastation she carried had etched itself into the lines around his eyes, and she wondered at this man who had every right to celebrate her destruction, yet seemed instead to share in its weight. "You are no longer my prisoner," he said, and his voice held none of the cold authority she had first known, only a weariness that spoke of battles fought within rather than without. "I took you to punish a man who, it seems, requires no enemy to destroy what he should cherish. Your father has punished you far more thoroughly than I ever could, and I find I have no stomach for adding to what he has already wrought." Eleanor stood very still, afraid that any movement might shatter this strange, fragile moment, and she watched as Callum retrieved something from his desk, a small leather purse that clinked with coins when he set it on the table between them. "There is enough here to see you safely to Edinburgh, and from there to whatever life you might build. I have written to a cousin who keeps a respectable house, a widow who might welcome a companion of good breeding, and she would ask no questions about your circumstances." The offer hung in the air between them, freedom rendered in gold and good intentions, and Eleanor looked at the purse and thought of Edinburgh's grey streets, of spending her days in some widow's parlour, making polite conversation about weather and embroidery, of never again seeing the mist roll through the glen at dawn, or hearing Gaelic songs echo through ancient halls, or watching this particular man's face soften when he forgot to guard himself against caring. "And if I choose to stay?" she heard herself ask, and the words emerged steady, despite the wild percussion of her heart against her ribs, and Callum's expression shifted through surprise into something more complex, something that looked almost like hope, strangled at birth by the hands of caution. "Then you would stay as my guest, with all the freedom "And respect that title commands," he replied carefully, "though I cannot imagine why you would choose to remain in the house of the man who stole you from your life, among people who have every reason to despise your English blood." But Eleanor thought of Flora bringing her heather, of Moira grudgingly teaching her to bake proper oatcakes, of Angus letting her name the new foal, and she understood that somewhere in the alchemy of her captivity, these people had become more family to her than any she had known by blood. "I have nowhere else where I belong," she said softly, and the truth of it ached in her chest. But beneath the ache bloomed something unexpected, not resignation, but the first tender shoots of choice, of claiming for herself a place in the world that no father could give or take away. Callum nodded slowly, and neither of them spoke of the other reasons she might stay, the dangerous, tender thing growing between them in firelit conversations and shared silences, but it lived in the room nonetheless, patient as the mountains, waiting for its season to arrive. Autumn descended upon the Highlands in a blaze of copper and gold, painting the ancient hills in colours so vivid they seemed to burn against the grey Scottish sky, and with the turning of the season came the gathering, that sacred tradition when MacTavish clansmen travelled from distant holdings to pay homage to their laird and celebrate the bonds of blood and loyalty that had sustained their people through centuries of struggle. Eleanor watched from her window as they arrived in waves throughout the week, men on sturdy Highland ponies and women in bright tartans, children running wild through the courtyard with the exuberant freedom of those raised in open spaces, and she felt something shift within her chest at the sight of this great family converging upon Dunore, this tapestry of lives woven together by something stronger than the cold transactional ties she had known in England. She had expected to remain in her chambers during the festivities, an outsider observing from the margins, but Moira appeared on the eve of the great feast with a bundle of fabric in her arms, a dress of deep green wool, trimmed with the MacTavish tartan, and the housekeeper's eyes held none of their former coldness as she declared that the laird's guest would not shame the clan by appearing in English rags. The great hall that night blazed with firelight and rang with music, pipes and fiddles weaving melodies that seemed to rise from the very stones of the castle, and Eleanor descended the stairs to find herself swept into a world utterly unlike any she had known. No rigid protocol here, no careful calculation of status and precedence, only the warmth of community and the fierce joy of a people who had learned to celebrate survival itself. She saw Callum then as she had never truly seen him before, not as her captor or her reluctant protector, but as the heart of this gathering, moving among his people with an ease that transformed his stern features into something approaching tenderness. He clasped forearms with weathered farmers and bent to hear the whispered confidences of elderly women. He lifted children onto his shoulders and listened with grave attention to the concerns of minor chieftains. And Eleanor understood at last why his people's loyalty ran so deep, why they would follow him into battle or poverty or any hardship the world might send. When Flora seized her hand and pulled her toward the dancers, Eleanor's protest died on her lips, and she found herself swept into a reel, the steps foreign but the spirit infectious, and somewhere between the spinning and the clapping and the laughter that bubbled up from some long dormant well within her, she forgot to be the reserved English noblewoman, forgot to be the abandoned daughter, forgot everything except the pure exhilaration of this moment, this music, this unexpected joy. She did not see Callum watching from across the hall, did not notice how his conversation faltered mid-sentence as his eyes found her among the dancers, did not observe the way his hand tightened around his cup or the expression that crossed his scarred face, something raw and wondering and terrified, something that looked very much like a man, watching his carefully constructed walls crumble into dust, while a woman with laughing eyes and flushed cheeks danced through the ruins of his defences, leaving devastation in her wake that felt, against all reason, like the first breath of spring after an endless winter. His name was Malcolm Fraser, chieftain of a prosperous holding to the north, and he was everything a Highland lord should be: tall and broad-shouldered, with russet hair and an easy laugh that drew people to him like moths to flame, and from the moment he saw Eleanor across the crowded great hall, he pursued her with the confident charm of a man unaccustomed to refusal. He sought her out during the morning meal, claiming the seat beside her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his warm brown eyes, and he asked questions about her life in England with what seemed genuine interest, making her laugh with tales of his own misadventures, and Eleanor found herself grateful for his uncomplicated attention, for the simple pleasure of conversation with a man who looked at her as though she were a prize worth winning rather than a problem to be solved. She did not notice how Callum's jaw tightened each time Fraser leaned close to whisper some jest in her ear, did not see the white-knuckled grip on his cup as Fraser led her through another dance, did not observe the way his grey eyes tracked their movements across the hall with an intensity that made Moira exchange knowing glances with Angus, but others noticed, the clan elders murmuring among themselves about their laird's sudden dark moods, about the way he found reasons to interrupt whenever Fraser monopolized their English guest, about the storm brewing behind his careful composure. It was on the third night of the gathering that Fraser found Eleanor walking alone in the moonlit courtyard, seeking respite from the noise and heat of the celebration, and he fell into step beside her with that easy confidence, speaking of how beautiful she looked in the silver light, of how a woman of her grace deserved a husband who would cherish her, of how his own holdings lacked only a lady to make them complete, and Eleanor understood then what she had failed to see, that this charming man was offering her something practical and safe, a life of comfort with a husband who would be kind if never quite beloved, and she opened her mouth to form some gentle refusal when a voice cut through the night like a blade. "Fraser, your men are asking for you. There is some dispute about horses that requires your attention." Callum emerged from the shadows near the garden wall, and his voice held that dangerous calm that Eleanor had learned to recognize as carefully leashed fury, and Fraser's expression flickered through surprise into something sharper, something that recognized a challenge when it was issued, and for a long moment the two men regarded each other across the moonlit stones, while Eleanor stood frozen between them, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Of course," Fraser said smoothly, though his eyes promised this conversation was not finished, and he bowed to Eleanor with elaborate courtesy before striding away into the darkness, leaving her alone with Callum and the weight of all that remained unspoken between them. "You had no right," she breathed, and she was surprised by her own anger, by the way it rose hot and sudden in her chest, because she had wanted Fraser's interruption, even as she resented Callum's presumption in providing it, and this contradiction left her feeling exposed and foolish and desperately confused. "No," Callum agreed, stepping closer until she could see the torment written in every line of his scarred face. "I have no right to anything where you are concerned. No claim, no." And his voice broke on the word, and Eleanor watched something shatter behind his grey eyes, and when he raised his hand to touch her cheek his fingers trembled, and she swayed toward him as though pulled by forces older than reason, and his breath was warm against her lips when the chapel bell suddenly tolled midnight, shattering the spell, and they sprang apart like guilty children, both shaking, both knowing that everything had changed. The discovery came not through confrontation or confession, but through the careless placement of documents left upon Callum's desk, papers Eleanor glimpsed while searching for a book he had promised to lend her, and at first the words refused to coalesce into meaning: land transfers, legal proclamations, dates that corresponded to the darkest chapter of MacTavish history. But as she read further, her blood turning to ice in her veins, the full scope of her father's treachery revealed itself in merciless detail. Lord Ashford had not merely betrayed Jamie MacTavish to the English authorities. He had orchestrated the entire affair with calculating precision, trading information about Jacobite sympathizers in exchange for promised lands and titles, and when Jamie's execution was carried out, her father had claimed the MacTavish coastal holdings, as his reward had literally profited from a young man's death, had built his fortune upon the scaffold, where a laughing boy of 20 breathed his last. Eleanor's hands trembled so violently that the papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, and she sank into Callum's chair as the room spun around her, bile rising in her throat at the realization that the man who had sired her was not merely negligent or cold, but actively monstrous, a creature who had sold innocent blood for acres and influence. She did not hear Callum enter, did not register his presence until his sharp intake of breath announced that he had found her there among the damning evidence of her father's villainy, and when she raised her eyes to meet his, she saw something she had not expected. Not triumph at her devastation, not satisfaction that she finally understood the depths of her family's crimes, but anguish, raw and unguarded, as though her pain caused him physical suffering. "You knew," she whispered, and her voice emerged strange and hollow, belonging to someone else entirely. "You knew all of this when you took me, when you held me prisoner, when you—" and she could not finish, could not articulate the magnitude of what he had kept from her through all these months of slowly building trust. "Yes," he said simply, and he made no move to approach her, standing in the doorway as though awaiting judgment. "I knew from the beginning. I have always known exactly what manner of man your father is." "Then why?" And the question tore from her throat like a wounded creature. "Why did you never tell me? Why did you let me write to him as though he were merely distant, rather than demonic? Why did you spare me this truth?" Callum crossed to where she sat and knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones, and his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch despite her anguish. "Because you had already lost so much," he said quietly. "Because I watched you grieve a father who never deserved your tears, and I could not," his voice roughened, "I could not be the one to destroy whatever fragments of hope you still harbored, even knowing you would hate me for the mercy." And Eleanor, looking into the face of the man who had chosen to protect her heart rather than vindicate his own vengeance, understood at last that love had crept upon them, both disguised as something else entirely. The English soldiers came with the first frost of November, a column of red-coated figures cutting through the grey Highland morning like a wound upon the landscape, and Eleanor watched their approach from her chamber window with a dread that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, knowing even before the messenger delivered his demands that her father's shadow had finally reached across the miles to reclaim her. They gathered in the great hall, Callum flanked by his most trusted men, Eleanor standing apart with Moira's hand gripping hers, and the English captain, a thin-lipped man, with the pinched expression of someone who found everything about this wild place distasteful, reading aloud from a document that bore her father's seal and proclaimed his paternal right to determine his daughter's fate. Lord Ashford, it seemed, had found a use for the daughter he had abandoned. A wealthy merchant sought a noble bride to legitimize his climbing ambitions, and Eleanor's hand had been promised in exchange for debts forgiven and alliances secured, and she was to be returned to England immediately to fulfill her duty to her family name. "The lady is not a prisoner here," Callum said, and his voice carried that dangerous calm that Eleanor had learned to recognize as barely leashed fury. "She remains at Dunore of her own choosing, and I will not compel her to leave against her will." The captain's lip curled with contempt as he surveyed the Highland laird, this scarred barbarian who dared to interfere with English affairs. "Lord Ashford anticipated your reluctance," he replied smoothly, "and bade me remind you that harboring an English noblewoman against her family's wishes could be considered an act of aggression, one that might invite scrutiny of your own questionable loyalties to the crown." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor saw how Callum's men shifted, hands moving toward weapons, the tension in the hall crackling like lightning before a storm. She understood then the impossible position her presence created, that keeping her here endangered not just Callum but his entire clan, that her father had calculated this moment with the same cold precision he had employed in destroying Jamie MacTavish, that once again an Ashford was forcing the MacTavishes to choose between their hearts and their survival. "I would speak with Lady Eleanor alone," Callum said quietly, and something in his tone brooked no argument, and the captain was escorted to wait in the courtyard while the hall emptied until only Eleanor and Callum remained, standing across from each other in the vast space that suddenly felt impossibly small. "You could go," he said, and each word seemed to cost him something vital. "You could return to England, make a respectable marriage, live the life you were born to. No one would blame you for choosing safety over—" he gestured, vaguely at the stone walls, at himself, at everything this place represented. "And if I stay," she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "Then you must stay because you choose it," he replied fiercely. "Not because I have manipulated or coerced or imprisoned you into remaining. I will not become another man who controls your fate, Eleanor. I will not be another cage." And she saw then what it cost him to offer her this freedom, saw the war between love and honor playing out across his scarred features, and she understood that this moment would define everything that came after. Eleanor walked out into the courtyard, where the English soldiers waited, their red coats stark against the grey stone and the muted Highland sky, and she felt the weight of every eye upon her. Callum's men watching from the battlements, Moira clutching her apron in the doorway, Flora peering from behind the kitchen wall, and the captain himself standing with barely concealed impatience, so certain of his mission's success that he had already ordered the horses prepared for departure. She thought of the life that awaited her in England, the cold manor house, the stranger husband purchased with her bloodline, the endless years of propriety and emptiness stretching before her like a road through winter wasteland, and she thought of what she would leave behind: the heather-scented mornings, the wild music of the gathering, the way Callum's rare smiles transformed his scarred face into something beautiful, the sense of belonging she had never known existed until she found it among people who should have been her enemies. "I will not go," she said, and her voice rang clear across the courtyard, startling even herself with its strength. "I claim sanctuary among the MacTavishes, and I renounce any claim my father believes he holds over my fate. I am no longer his daughter to barter and sell." The captain's face contorted with fury, and he stepped toward her with threatening intent, but before he could speak, Callum's men had descended from the walls, forming a silent barrier between the soldiers and their would-be prize, and the captain understood then that he would not leave this place with Eleanor Ashford unless he was prepared to spill blood for her blood that would cost England far more than one unwilling bride was worth. They departed with threats and promises of consequences, but Eleanor barely heard them, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that all other sound faded to meaningless noise, and when the last red coat had disappeared through the gates, she turned to find that Callum had vanished from the hall. She found him in the small chapel tucked into the castle's oldest wing, standing before the memorial stone that bore Jamie's name, and the candlelight cast dancing shadows across his face as he traced the carved letters with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "You should not have done that," he said without turning. "You have made yourself an exile. You have burned every bridge back to your world." But his voice broke on the final word, and Eleanor crossed the stone floor to stand beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, close enough to see the moisture gathering in his grey eyes. "My world is here now," she said softly. "My world is this castle and these people and—" She paused, gathering courage like a cloak around her shoulders. "My world is you, Callum MacTavish. It has been you since the night you spoke of Jamie by the fire, since you chose to protect my heart when you had every right to break it, since I understood that vengeance had transformed into something neither of us expected." He turned to her then, and the raw hunger in his expression stole her breath, and when he cupped her face in his battle-roughened hands, she saw wonder warring with disbelief in his eyes. "I am not a gentleman," he warned, his voice rough as Highland stone. "I am scarred and bitter, and I have lived so long with hatred." But she silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, and the kiss that followed was everything: tenderness and desperation, homecoming and discovery. The culmination of months of longing finally given voice, and when they broke apart, breathless and trembling, Jamie's memorial stood witness to the moment when enmity completed its transformation into love. The winter softened into spring before the wedding day arrived, for Callum had insisted that Eleanor have time to be certain, time to understand fully what she was choosing, and Eleanor had used those months to weave herself so completely into the fabric of Dunore that by the time the heather bloomed purple across the hills, no one could remember a time when she had not belonged among them. The morning of the ceremony dawned with that particular crystalline quality unique to the Highlands in late May. The sky a pale wash of blue ribboned with gold, and Eleanor stood in the chamber that had once been her prison, while Moira and Flora dressed her in the MacTavish tartan, the ancient colours draping across her shoulder and pinned with a silver brooch that had belonged to Callum's mother, and she studied her reflection in the polished mirror and saw not an English lady playing at being Scottish, but a woman transformed, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, tempered into something stronger. The great hall had been filled with spring flowers and greenery, the scent of heather and wild roses perfuming the air, and when Eleanor descended the stairs on Angus's arm, for the gentle stable-master had become the closest thing to a father she had ever truly known, she found the space packed with MacTavishes from across the Highlands, clansmen and their families who had travelled for days to witness their laird's marriage to the English lass who had captured his heart. Callum waited at the far end of the hall beside the ancient stone fireplace where generations of MacTavish lords had spoken their vows, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him dressed in full Highland regalia, his scarred face transformed by an expression she had never seen before, hope, unhidden and unguarded, softening the harsh lines that grief and vengeance had carved into his features. The ceremony itself blended the old ways with the new. the minister speaking the formal words, while Moira performed the traditional hand-fasting, binding their wrists together with ribbons of MacTavish tartan, and when Callum spoke his vows, his voice carried not just to Eleanor, but to every person gathered in that hall. "I took you as my enemy's daughter," he said, his grey eyes never leaving hers. "I held you as my prisoner. I watched you become the heart of my household, and somewhere in the watching, I lost myself to you entirely, Eleanor. You came to Dunore seeking nothing but survival, and instead, you gave us something we had forgotten was possible. You gave us redemption. You taught these bitter walls how to hope again, and I vow before my clan and my ancestors and the God who sees all hearts that I will spend every remaining day of my life proving worthy of the gift you have given me." Moira wept openly, her weathered face streaming with tears she made no effort to hide, and Flora bounced with barely contained joy. And when the minister pronounced them wed and Callum kissed his bride, the hall erupted in cheers that shook the ancient stones, and Eleanor tasted salt on her lips, her own tears mingling with his, and understood that she had never in her life been so completely, so perfectly, so irrevocably home. 7 years had passed since the wedding day, when Eleanor stood at the great hall window watching her children race across the courtyard below. Jamie, named for the uncle he would never know, with his father's dark hair and his mother's laughing eyes, and wee Margaret, barely 4, toddling determinedly after her brother with the fierce stubbornness that Moira claimed, came directly from the MacTavish bloodline, and Eleanor marvelled, as she did each morning, at how completely her life had transformed from the terrified prisoner in the tower to the beloved lady of Dunmore, her days filled not with emptiness and longing, but with purpose and joy, and a love so deep it sometimes stole her breath. Castle Dunmore itself had changed, the forbidding fortress softened by years of happiness, tapestries replacing bare stone, flowers blooming in window boxes, the sound of children's laughter echoing through corridors that had once known only grief, and the clan had flourished under their laird's steady hand, the old wounds of war slowly healing as a new generation grew up knowing peace instead of vengeance. Callum emerged from the stables with young Jamie perched on his shoulders, the boy shrieking with delight, and Eleanor watched her husband's face, the scars still there but somehow gentler now, the harsh lines around his grey eyes softened by years of smiling, the bitter tension that had once held his jaw replaced by an ease she had helped him find, and she remembered the cold, remote man who had stood in judgment over her that first terrifying day, and wondered if he had known then, in some deep and hidden part of his heart, that she would become his redemption. They walked together that afternoon to the hillside where Jamie MacTavish lay buried, the grave marked by a simple stone carved with the words, "Beloved brother," gone too young, and surrounded by the purple heather that bloomed each summer as if the land itself remembered, and Callum knelt to place fresh flowers, while Eleanor stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder. This ritual of remembrance, one they had performed together countless times, their shared grief transformed over the years into something like peace. "He would have loved the children," Callum said softly, his voice carrying that particular roughness it always held when he spoke of his brother. "He would have spoiled them terribly and taught them all manner of mischief." And Eleanor smiled through the tears that pricked her eyes, for she had heard so many stories of Jamie over the years that she felt she knew him, this laughing young man whose death had set in motion the chain of events that led her to her truest home. Flora, now a young woman soon to be married herself, met them at the castle gates with a letter that had arrived by messenger, and Eleanor recognized her father's seal with a strange detachment. The old wound so thoroughly healed that even this reminder of him brought only a distant ache rather than the sharp pain of years past, and when she read the brief message informing her of Lord Ashford's death alone in his crumbling estate, his fortune squandered, his name disgraced by debts and broken promises, she felt not satisfaction, but something like pity for a man who had never understood that love, freely given, was worth more than all the gold and land in England. Dear listener, as the mist settles over the Highland hills and the last light of this tale fades into the gloaming, perhaps you find yourself wondering what truth lies at the heart of Eleanor and Callum's story, what lesson might be drawn from the long journey that began with a carriage ambushed in the fog and ended with children laughing in a castle that had learned to hope again. And I would offer you this, that the walls we build to protect our wounded hearts, those towering fortresses of bitterness and vengeance and carefully nursed grievances, become in time not shelters but prisons, and we become not the jailers but the jailed, trapped behind stones of our own making until someone arrives with the unexpected key, and often that key comes in the most improbable form, wrapped in the very trappings of the enemy we have taught ourselves to hate. For life has a way of offering redemption through the last door we would think to open. Consider how Callum took Eleanor as his prisoner and found himself captive instead, how his carefully constructed revenge crumbled not through force, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small moments, a shared love of poetry discovered during a storm, a vigil kept over a fevered child, the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to become the villain her father's blood should have made her, and understand that this is the strange alchemy of the human heart, that hatred held too long becomes exhausting, that vengeance pursued past its season turns to ash in the mouth, and that sometimes the bravest thing a wounded soul can do is simply set down the weapon and allow itself to be surprised by grace. Perhaps you carry your own burdens, dear listener, your own betrayals and griefs, and carefully catalogued wrongs that wake you in the small hours of the night. And perhaps you have built your own castle Dunore, fortress walls of justified anger, keeping the world at a safe and terrible distance. And if so, I would not presume to tell you that forgiveness is easy, or that old wounds heal without scars, for Eleanor bore the mark of her father's abandonment all her days, and Callum never stopped visiting his brother's grave. But I would gently suggest that there is a difference between honoring our pain and being consumed by it, between remembering what we have lost and refusing to see what we might yet gain, and that the transformation from prisoner to beloved, from enemy to family, from vengeance to love, begins not with forgetting but with the terrifying courage of allowing someone past the walls. So as you go forth from this story, may you find your own unexpected key, your own stranger who becomes salvation, your own storm-tossed library where connection sparks in the space between guarded hearts, and may you have the wisdom to recognize grace when it arrives, wearing the last face you expected, and may your own castle, whatever form it takes, fill in time with laughter and light, and the particular peace that comes only when we finally, lay down the sword and open our arms instead. And may you rest well tonight, dear listener, and may all hearts, in the end, find their way home to the highlands of their own belonging.